Welcome back to New Market Arms. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about bayonets, and not just any bayonets, but rod bayonets. Worst firearms design ever? Are they even legal? Let's find out. The bayonet traces its lineage back to the sharp stick, literally. The first weapon very well may have been a big stick to hit someone, and then, if it was sufficiently sharpened, to stab somebody. The stick would quickly give rise to the lance, a long pole with either an iron or a bronze point. The lance would remain in service in the field well into the 19th century, but in that role it was typically a cavalry weapon. The infantryman's version of the lance became the bayonet. Now, in American history at least, the first bayonet was the socket bayonet. And what was wrong with it? Nothing. It worked just fine. But it was a separate piece of equipment with a separate scabbard that had to be manufactured, and it had to be fixed to the weapon. It could also be lost. Was there a better way? Well, the U.S. Army hoped so, and in 1836 they came up with the idea of a triangular ramrod bayonet that could be affixed to the Hall Model 1836 carbine. Almost the identical design will reappear 44 years later in the Model 1880 rifle. So, why the ramrod bayonet? First, so the theory went, it reduced the soldier's load, which for an infantryman is always a good thing. A soldier could now have a firearm with a bayonet that's stowed in the weapon itself. It was lighter than a separate bayonet and scabbard, and could even double as a ramrod for the weapon. For muzzle-loading firearms, however, it was not ideal, as you could stab yourself if you used the ramrod in the typical fashion. At any rate, it proved not to be popular with soldiers, and the idea was dropped shortly afterwards in 1837. All throughout the Civil War, the old socket bayonet would reign supreme. Until 1880, when the concept reemerged, the Army had lots of old socket bayonets left over from the Civil War, but they were for a larger diameter barrel. Now, the Army could have modified the sockets on existing bayonets, or they could have designed a sleeve for the Model 1873 trapdoor rifles. But the vision of lightening the soldier's load, and just as important back then, cutting costs, reappeared with the Model 1880 experimental triangular rod bayonet rifle. Springfield manufactured only 1,000 of these rifles, all in 1881 and all as an experiment, and they issued them to the field for testing. Predictably, they did not do well. The soldiers didn't like them, and they were prone to bending when used as an actual bayonet. The Model 1880's triangular rod bayonet was a little over 35.5 inches long in total, and slightly over half of that was formed into a triangular blade, with the rear half being round like a regular cleaning rod. The end was even threaded to accept cleaning implements. One of the problems was fixing bayonets. In theory, it's simple. You simply push up on the release mechanism, slide the bayonet out until it locks into place. In practice, it was ill-conceived. There were 11 serrations on 2 of the 3 sides in order to pull the bayonet out, but with wet hands it'd be difficult. With bloody hands, it was probably impossible to withdraw the bayonet. The locking mechanism was also insufficient, with a simply spring-loaded stud designed to secure the bayonet in position. But this locking mechanism was insufficient to keep the bayonet secured in its fixed position. On the Model 1880, a sliding key was installed to help ensure the lock held, but it was just lipstick on a pig because the design was fatally flawed. It just wasn't strong enough. But the triangular blade was still a deadly weapon if everything aligned properly, if the rod did not bend, and if the locking mechanism held. It did not, though, predictably do well in field trials for the Army, but the Army didn't give up on the design. The Army next moved to a round rod bayonet with a small triangular point. This experiment led to the Model 1884 rod bayonet design. It did not do very well either. But the Army was nothing if not persistent, and they pushed on with the design, eventually coming up with the Model 1888 round rod bayonet rifle. The bayonet was the same length as the Model 1880, and it still doubled as a clean rod, but it suffered from the same problems as its predecessors. Eventually, the Army learned its lesson, though, and came back with a very modern knife bayonet when the Krag series of rifles were introduced and adopted in the mid-1890s. Old habits die hard, however, and when the Army introduced its Model 1903 rifle, it had, a round bayonet. This retro design was proudly shown to the then President of the United States, Teddy Roosevelt, who promptly said to the assembled officers, quote, "I must say I think the rod bayonet about as poor an invention as I ever saw," end quote. One can imagine how quickly the smiles on the ordnance officers fell off their faces. Well, the Army took the hint and quickly came back with the Model 1905 knife bayonet, which was a proper 16-inch long blade that could be affixed to the barrel and removed. Finally, the rod bayonet design was put to bed, this time for good. Now, as I was preparing this video, I recalled hearing over the years that the reason the Army got rid of the rod bayonet was because it violated the Geneva Convention. The story goes that puncture wounds are harder to treat and sew up, and that's why we don't see rod bayonets today. So I thought I'd briefly address the issue here. Caveat: while I am a lawyer now, I'm not an international law lawyer, and I was never a JAG officer in the military. I was an infantry officer. But I'm pretty sure the following is the current law, so here goes. Well, are rod bayonets or blades with serrated edges legal in war? What about blades with 3, 4, or even 5 or 6 sides? The bayonet at the top, by the way, is the M9 bayonet, which was the issue bayonet the entire time I was in the Army, and I've included it because it has a serrated edge on the top of the blade. The bottom bayonet is a World War II British spike bayonet, a sort of British cousin to the old American rod bayonet. Now, how about this old girl? Would she be legal today? Interestingly, it was this bayonet in particular that gave rise to many of the misconceptions about the legality of bayonets in war. Well, the short answer is yes. This bayonet and the others, rod bayonets, they're legal even today. Maybe. To understand this, you have to look at numerous treaties, international laws, and customs of war as they developed over time. Most people cite the Geneva Convention, and it's actually plural, the Geneva Conventions, as it's been added to over time. But the Hague Conventions actually came first in the late 1800s and early 1900s before World War I. The Hague Conventions were the first to internationally recognize a set of laws of war, what are known today as the laws of armed conflict. The Geneva Conventions came after World War I and dealt principally with non-combatants and prisoners of war. Now, I said a moment ago, because interpretation of the Geneva Convention today are influenced heavily by the International Committee of Red Cross based in Geneva, Switzerland. And that's why I use the caveat, maybe they're legal. While not binding law, the International Committee of the Red Cross states that bayonets or knives with serrated edges should be considered unlawful. That position is not binding on signatories to the Geneva Conventions, however. So, as the international law stands today, the rule on bayonets, and other weapons for that matter, is that they cannot be, quote, calculated to cause superfluous injury, end quote. I think that definition is itself superfluous since the purpose of the bayonet is to kill, but I'll leave that discussion for others. As for serrated edge weapons, they are lawful so long as the intent of the design is not to, quote, aggravate suffering unnecessarily. So it all depends on the intent of the design of the weapon that you're talking about. If the intent, for example, is to make the bayonet multi-purpose, so you can use it to cut barbed wire or use it to saw off tree limbs, then it's good to go. That even goes for larger edge weapons such as machetes or even entrenching tools. Now, an individual who takes a issue bayonet such as the M9 and modifies it with a file to create certain barbs, that would create an unlawful weapon. Now, it must be pointed out there are many lawyers around the world and even here in the U.S. who disagree with this interpretation. But that's the current American interpretation, so that's where we are. Well, it started out being a discussion on the Model 1880 Springfield experimental triangular rod bayonet rifle, which is a mouthful. But I wanted to delve into a little bit of the history of the bayonets and the legality of those weapons, so since it has appeared to come up from time to time. That's it for now. Thanks for joining me out here.